Rhiannon from the Epsom Bakehouse, and today we'll be discussing why your bread might still be quite pale even though you've baked it according to the recipe. If you enjoyed this video and you'd like to know more about baking your own great bread at home, then you can sign up for my top 5 bread making tips via the link below. So you're wanting to bake a beautiful loaf of crusty bread at home, and you mix, knead, prove your dough, bake it in the oven. What you're looking for is a crusty brown loaf, beautiful smell filling the kitchen, but what you pull out of the oven isn't quite what you expected. It's still pale and it doesn't have that beautiful crust as you cut through it. Well, today I'd like to share some tips with you on how you can make sure you get that beautiful brown golden crust on each one of your loaves every time you bake at home. First, let's discuss what actually makes that beautiful golden brown crust on your loaf. It's actually a reaction that happens at a high temperature in the oven as the dough bakes. And it's a reaction between sugars in the dough and amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins, and they react together at that high temperature to form this beautiful golden brown crust. So if you're looking to get that similar result and you haven't quite got there yet, here are my top 3 tips to get started. First up, are you baking your loaf at the right temperature? Bread generally needs to be baked at a really hot temperature in your oven. I'm talking for a general straight loaf of flour, water, salt and yeast of around 220 to 225 degrees centigrade. So if you've been baking your loaf at below 200 degrees centigrade, it's time to turn up the oven a bit and make sure you get that high temperature before you load in your dough to be baked. As I was saying, the brown crust forms because of a reaction that only occurs at these high temperatures, so you need to make sure that your oven is preheated enough before you start baking your loaf. Second tip, introduce some steam into your oven whilst you're baking. The easiest way to do this is to put an old baking tray at the bottom of your oven, and just after you've loaded your dough in to be baked, pour a cup of water very carefully into the hot tray and it will start to evaporate into steam. Close the door as quickly as you can to trap as much of the steam in your oven. The first thing that steam will do is condense onto the top of your cold dough, and it will actually start to gelatinize the starch in your dough. That gelatinized starch will form the crisp and glossy crust that you are looking for in your bread. Steam also helps with the overall bake of your loaf. Remember that I was saying that the brown of your crust forms because of a reaction between the amino acids and the sugars in your dough. When the steam condenses on your dough in the oven, it actually helps slow down that reaction of the brown crust forming and helps your loaf rise and cook well in the oven before a thin, crispy crust forms. If you didn't have some of that steam in, the crust would form more quickly. The loaf might not rise as quickly, and that sugar and amino acid reaction will happen, but it will create a duller and thicker crust. It might not be quite what you're looking for. The third and last tip is to not let your dough rise too much, or indeed too little. What's happening as your dough rises is that starches are being broken down by the yeast in your dough to form sugars. The brown crust is formed by a reaction between sugars and amino acids in your dough. So you do need to give time for that process of sugars to be produced by the yeast breaking down your dough. Either your dough might rise too little and too little sugar is produced and your dough will never brown as much as you expected. Or, if you leave your dough to overproof, i.e. it rises too much, the yeast will not only have broken down the starch into sugars, but they'll also be feeding on those sugars and using them up. Again, there's less sugar to react and to create that brown crust. So those are my top tips if your bread is baking according to the recipe, but it's still coming out the oven too pale for your liking. So you can make sure you're baking at the right hot temperature to bake bread at in your oven. Think about introducing some steam into your oven to help that crust form and brown. And lastly, don't under or overproof your dough. Make sure it's well risen just before you put it into the oven to bake. I hope that's been helpful. If you've enjoyed these bread making tips or you have any further questions, do leave a comment on this video. And as before, if you'd like any more of these bread making tips, you can sign up for more via the link below. Thanks for watching, and I look forward to chatting all things baking great bread at home again soon. Bye!